20 years of silence. Then a 6.5-hour flight to Hawaii. That's how Nick Lachey ended up sitting closer to Jessica Simpson than he had in 2 decades. And it's the moment that pushed him to finally talk on camera about a marriage the whole country once watched fall apart. Back in the late 90s, Nick Lachey was already a working pop star. He was the steady, more experienced member of 98 Degrees, a group that spent years competing for chart space with the Backstreet Boys and Dennis Wancy. Jessica Simpson, on the other hand, was still a teenager from Texas with a big voice, a deeply religious upbringing, and a father who managed every step of her career. When the two started dating in 1999, Nick was the established one. Jessica was just getting started. That gap in experience and fame would end up shaping almost everything that came after. They got engaged in February 2002 and married that October in a large Texas wedding. Nick was 28. Jessica was 22. By her own account in later years, she was still figuring out who she was, having grown up committed to saving herself for marriage and having never really dated anyone before Nick. He was, in her words, effectively her first serious relationship. At the time of the wedding, Nick was actually the bigger name in the industry, and reports at the time suggested Jessica's father advised against a prenuptial agreement, since Nick appeared to have more to lose financially. That single decision would matter enormously a few years later. In 2003, MTV pitched the couple a small reality series about married life. The idea wasn't ambitious. Nick has said in interviews, including a 2025 appearance on the podcast Richer Lives, that the whole thing was meant to be a short run of episodes designed to promote albums both he and Jessica had coming out. Neither of them expected it to become anything more than a promotional tool. Instead, Newlyweds, Nick and Jessica premiered in August 2003 and turned into one of the biggest reality shows of the decade, second only to The Osbournes as an early example of the genre. Audiences couldn't get enough of watching two young, famous newlyweds navigate ordinary married life on camera. Jessica became the breakout star of the show almost immediately, largely because of her total lack of a filter. The most famous scene from the entire series is the one where she held up a can of tuna labeled Chicken of the Sea and genuinely asked whether it was chicken or fish. That clip became one of the most replayed moments of 2000s television. What a lot of people don't know is that Jessica has since said, including in her memoir Open Book, that she leaned into that ditzy image on purpose. She wanted viewers to like Nick, to see him as the patient, grounded one in the relationship, so she downplayed her own intelligence on camera to make that dynamic work. It helped the show. It did not help her reputation, which spent years being defined by a persona she had partly built herself to protect her husband's image. Ironically, the show ended up launching Jessica into a completely different level of stardom anyway. She landed a role in the Dukes of Hazzard, built a fashion label, released platinum albums, and eventually created a business empire. Nick benefited too, gaining a wider audience and a likable everyman reputation that opened doors beyond music, but the two careers were not moving at the same speed. Jessica was becoming a business phenomenon. Nick was becoming a well-liked TV personality. That widening gap in fame and earning power became a quiet source of pressure inside the marriage, one that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with imbalance. The tension wasn't only happening off-camera. Newlyweds itself captured real friction between the two of them, including at least one well-known episode where they disagreed openly about the state of their physical relationship. The show's producer, Sue Kalinsky, later told Complex magazine that Nick and Jessica were genuinely different people and that the friction audiences saw was real, not staged for entertainment. What the cameras couldn't show was what was happening away from set. As Jessica's fame exploded, with film shoots, magazine covers, and endorsement deals filling her schedule, the ordinary time a couple needs just to be alone together kept shrinking. And because a production crew was often nearby even when cameras weren't rolling, the show removed the privacy a strained marriage usually relies on to work through its problems. Outside pressures added to the strain. During filming for the Dukes of Hazzard in 2004, reports surfaced about a close bond between Jessica and her co-star Johnny Knoxville. Jessica addressed this directly in her memoir, acknowledging an emotional connection but also making clear that distance between her and Nick had already set in before that happened. In other words, the outside relationship was a symptom of a marriage that was already cracking, not the cause of the crack itself. Newlyweds ended its run in March 2005. Jessica filed for divorce that December, only 7 months later. Nick has said in multiple interviews that the split caught him off guard, describing a conversation after dinner where Jessica raised the subject and he simply didn't see it coming. The filings cited irreconcilable differences, and the marriage that had been broadcast into millions of living rooms every week was over. What followed financially is one of the more overlooked parts of this story. Nick had reportedly wanted a prenuptial agreement before the wedding, and Jessica turned it down, not for strategic reasons but because, at 22 and deeply in love, the suggestion felt to her like a lack of faith in the marriage. At the time, the decision made a kind of sense, since Nick was the more financially established one. By the time divorce proceedings started, though, the numbers had flipped entirely. Jessica's estimated net worth had climbed into the tens of millions, while Nick's was a fraction of that. Because California treats marital assets as community property without a prenup in place, that reversal mattered a great deal. Reports from the time, including coverage from Star magazine, indicated Nick came away with a settlement that included a stake in Jessica's beauty line, proceeds from the sale of their home, investment accounts, and a car that had been a gift during the marriage. Jessica has since called skipping the prenup one of the biggest financial mistakes of her career, a point she's made in interviews discussing her business decisions. It's a lesson that clearly stuck, even as the fashion brand she built afterward eventually grew into a business valued in the hundreds of millions. Nick, for his part, never publicly criticized Jessica after the split. Instead, he channeled the breakup into music, releasing the album What's Left of Me in 2006, with a title track widely understood to be about the divorce. It became the biggest solo hit of his career and even got its own MTV special, standing out as one of the more openly emotional responses to heartbreak that pop music produced in that era. After the divorce was finalized in 2006, Nick and Jessica didn't just drift apart, they went completely silent. No public interactions, no mutual appearances, nothing, for close to 20 years. Nick has described the relationship since then as neither friendly nor hostile, just non-existent. Both moved on and built entirely separate lives. Nick married Vanessa Minnillo in 2011, and the two now have 3 children together. He also became a co-host of Netflix's Love is Blind, a role that reintroduced him to audiences as a more grounded, reflective version of the guy from Newlyweds. Jessica married former NFL player Eric Johnson in 2014 after several years together, and the couple had 3 children of their own. Her fashion label grew into one of the most successful celebrity-driven brands in American retail, and her 2020 memoir, Open Book, became a bestseller that finally gave fans a fuller, more honest account of what her 20s had actually looked like behind the cameras. Then, in March 2026, 2 decades almost to the point after their divorce was finalized, Nick and Jessica ended up on the same commercial flight from Los Angeles to Kauai. The flight lasted around 6.5 hours. Initial reports, including from TMZ, suggested the moment was tense, claiming Jessica switched seats to avoid being near Nick and that he looked visibly caught off guard when he realized she was on board. Weeks later, on an episode of Watch What Happens Live, Nick gave his own account directly to Andy Cohen and confirmed the run-in was real. According to Nick, both families were present. He was traveling with Vanessa and their 3 kids, while Jessica sat with her mother, Tina Simpson, and her estranged husband, Eric Johnson, from whom she had separated in 2025, was seated elsewhere with their children. Nick described the whole thing as surprisingly fine, saying everyone involved was cordial and respectful, and that despite 20 years of zero contact, the flight passed without incident. Whether the earlier tense reports or Nick's calmer version is more accurate probably depends on which specific moment you're looking at. The initial shock of seeing an ex after 2 decades versus how things settled once the flight got underway. That flight became the reason this story resurfaced at all in 2026, and it's worth pausing on why the wider Nick and Jessica narrative tends to leave something out. Jessica was 22 when the marriage began and had essentially no prior experience with serious adult relationships. The show and the marriage were unfolding at the same time, and to make that show work, to get audiences rooting for the couple, Jessica made herself the punchline, the sweet, ditzy newlywed who didn't know if tuna was chicken. That choice entertained millions of people, but it also cost her years of being underestimated and mocked in a media environment that was notably harsher on young women than it ever was on their male co-stars. Nick never faced anything close to the same level of public ridicule during or after the split. That imbalance in how each of them was treated is a big part of why their post-divorce paths looked so different for so long, with Jessica spending years working to be taken seriously professionally, while Nick left the marriage with his likability largely intact. Today, at 52, Nick is in a stable place. His marriage to Vanessa has lasted well over a decade, Love is Blind remains one of Netflix's most-watched unscripted shows, and he has an upcoming documentary project about the boy band era in the works. Jessica, now 45, is navigating her own second major split, having separated from Eric Johnson in early 2025 after a decade together, with the divorce process continuing into 2026 while the two co-parent their 3 kids. Reports earlier this year suggested she's begun a new relationship with a Nashville-based musician. In interviews, Jessica has reflected on how her divorce from Nick felt like the end of the world at 25, but from where she stands now, it reads as the beginning of the most productive and self-defined stretch of her life and career. That perspective is really what ties this whole story together. The flight to Hawaii wasn't a reunion and it wasn't a blow-up, it was just 2 people with 2 decades of separate growth behind them, sitting in the same cabin somewhere over the Pacific and getting through it without drama. Nick didn't reveal some hidden secret about why the marriage ended. The honest answer has been sitting in plain sight for years: a young couple who fell in love fast, got put under a level of public pressure almost no relationship could survive, and grew apart while millions watched it happen in real time. What's changed isn't the reason. It's that both of them are finally far enough removed from it to talk about it without flinching. So what do you think actually ended things between Nick and Jessica? The fame, the show, the age gap, or just 2 people who were never quite ready for what they signed up for? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the real stories behind the biggest celebrity relationships, subscribe and turn on notifications.